Christ is risen. The date was April 8th, 2007, Easter Sunday morning. The church was filled with people dressed in their finest. There were flowers everywhere and this spirit of anticipation in the air. It was not unlike today. As I recall, the sanctuary in my former church in Washington, D.C. was set up specially that day with risers behind the preacher's pulpit for the festival choir to sit during the service. I was the pastor, and as such, I was preaching the Easter sermon, the Super Bowl of preaching, some of us like to say. And I was just rounding the corner for the final lap of the sermon. The congregation was still engaged. I thought I had some fairly funny jokes thrown in there, and frankly, I was ready to finish that sermon and get it behind me. And I'm sure that I was making some kind of deeply profound point, looking out at the congregation as I turned the second to last page of my sermon manuscript, and that's when things went south. The first indication that I had that something was wrong was a loud, collective gasp from the baritone section right behind me. It was a sound executed in unison as only a trained choir can. Startled, I had glanced down at my sermon manuscript only to see that the page I'd turned, well, not the last page of the sermon, was in fact the last page of the manuscript that I had with me in the pulpit. There were 2 full pages of the sermon gone. The end was missing. Now, some version of this has happened to me more times than I would like to admit, the most recent being this last Thursday night, as a matter of fact. Tell a story like this in a group of preachers, and it's like running your fingernails down a chalkboard. This is the stuff of preacher nightmares. Can you feel that sense of panic? I think the early Christians must have had that same feeling when they first picked up Mark's gospel and read it, the oldest gospel account in our biblical witness. See, the original manuscript ends, as our gospel reading did today, with a small group of women discovering an empty tomb and then turning to leave. They were filled with so much fear that they knew they couldn't tell anyone what they'd seen. Not a very satisfactory ending, to say the least. And so, if you were to pick up your Bible right now and turn to the Gospel of Mark, you would see that chapter 16, which we heard today, actually goes on a little longer than that original ending. 12 verses, to be exact. And scholars know that those were added on later, and you know why. Because ending the story of Jesus with his last holdout disciples fleeing in terror and unable to tell anyone what they'd seen, well, that isn't exactly inspiring. Today's story of resurrection is a tale for fools. At least that's what the women who first experienced it thought. Mark's ending made the first Christians panic, gasping like Mark had maybe lost the last few pages of his manuscript, and folks were so worried about this that they added on those nice stories at the end, stories that actually did tie things up in a beautiful bow that finished the resurrection account off in an appropriately inspirational way. We can keep reading in the Gospel of Mark, but when we do that, it's easy to forget that this story of an incredible turn of events, the conquest of life over death, was a story that belonged to people who existed on the margins of society, who did not feel it was safe to talk about what had happened to them because nobody would believe their story anyway. Sound familiar? Mary Magdalene and Salome had woken up that early that morning, gathered the supplies they needed to embalm Jesus' body, and trudged toward the tomb. They weren't doing anything particularly heroic. In fact, they were just doing their chores, the next thing that needed to be done. That last week, It had turned their lives upside down. They had been friends and followers of the Rabbi Jesus, but his message had gotten too strident, too political, too challenging to the people in power. And as we know, power never cedes without a fight. At the end of the day, their friend Jesus was dead, and the men who had been part of their group were in hiding, scared for their lives. So it was left to the women, the folks at the bottom of the social ladder, to pick up the pieces, to show up in the darkness, to be there in the dying. Remember the timeline here. Archaeologists tell us that Jewish burial customs during Jesus' time would have required his friends and families to bury him the same day that he died. That's for sanitary reasons, but also to conform to Mosaic law. And to prepare his body for burial, they would have washed it and they would have covered it with precious perfumed oils and spices. Fresh linen would have been tied around his hands and his feet, and a kerchief placed over his face. And then they would have gone to a tomb and laid his body on a large rock slab. And then the tomb would have been sealed with a very large boulder. But you know, not unlike everything else that Jesus did, even in death, he did not conform to the rules. Remember, Jesus died toward the late afternoon on a Friday. His disciples probably didn't have time to give his body the care they would have liked to because the Sabbath was approaching. Beginning at sundown Friday, going all the way to sundown on Saturday, a time during which they could do no work at all. They must have hurried to the tomb and did the best they could, leaving his body there until they had an opportunity to come back and finish the burial rite. But it was the women who were assigned that task, and as they made their way to the tomb this morning, their hearts must have been heavy, their bodies tired. All this time they had hoped. They had hoped that things would finally be different, that Jesus' message of liberation could change their lives. But there they were on the first morning of the week, up at dawn, going to do their duty and finally bury the friend who had made them imagine a world in which the desolation of their lives on the margins would ease. As they hurried to the tomb, you heard the text, they were worried, understandably, that they wouldn't be able to move the heavy stone blocking the entrance. But when they got there, the stone was already rolled away. Tentatively, and you know, with a feeling of dread, they entered the tomb to find a young man dressed in a white robe sitting there, and no Jesus whatsoever. "Don't be afraid," the young man said, which is objectively one of the most ridiculous things one might say in a situation like that. But throughout the Bible, this phrase is a literary tool that's used to signal something big. Whenever someone unusual shows up and says, "Don't be afraid," it's a precursor to an announcement of some important news. And in this case, the news was important. The best, most unbelievable news they could imagine. The women had come to the tomb that morning to finish their chores, to get the job done, to pick up the pieces after the other disciples had left them holding the bag. But suddenly, they had become the first to hear a story of such power that it changed everything. Jesus was not there. He was risen, and he was already back at work. "Go tell the other disciples," the women were instructed. But they couldn't. And so Mark's gospel ends like this. The women fled the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is how the greatest story ever told ends. Pages missing? Maybe not. You heard it here first. Remember this name. Someday, Naomi Wadler is going to be your boss, or maybe your president. She's only 11 years old, but a few weeks ago, she organized a walkout in her elementary school in Arlington, Virginia. The walkout protested gun violence in America. Organizers of last week's March for Our Lives took notice of Naomi and invited her to join the program at the March for Our Lives rally in Washington, D.C. With courage and pluck, she focused her level gaze on that massive crowd and delivered one of the most inspiring speeches of the day. "My name is Naomi, and I am 11 years old," she began. She went on to say that she was raising her voice that day to remember the lives of gun violence victims whose names are never spoken or remembered. The many African American girls and women whose deaths don't make the front page of every national newspaper, and who become numbers and statistics instead of names and individuals. Their stories matter too, she told the crowd. She continued to say that a lot of people had written her off as a tool of some unnamed adult, but she declared as she pulled herself up to stand tall, "I know that life isn't equal for everyone, and I know what's right and wrong." Naomi then went on to underscore her commitment to speaking for those who do not have a voice and left the crowd with this directive: "I urge everyone here and everyone who hears my voice to join me in telling the stories that aren't told, to honor the girls, the women of color who are murdered at disproportionate rates in this nation, so that these girls and women are never forgotten." Naomi called us that day to listen to voices that are so often unheard, because sometimes it's the unheard stories that hold the most power of all. It is true that the women at the tomb fled afraid and told no one what they had seen, but can you really blame them? They were firmly planted on the margins of society, a class of people whose voices were discounted if they were even heard at all. They knew if they told the story of what they'd seen, they would be called fools, maybe even facing retribution for telling a story that pushed back so strongly against the structures of power that existed around them, keeping them down. But Mark gives us a gift today, because he gives us a finality to the resurrection story that has more parallels to our modern situation than any story with a neat antiseptic ending. Why? Because a message of life that challenges the powers of the world is scary, it's threatening, it's dangerous, and it can change the world. Death does not have the final word. Love wins in the end. Good overcomes evil. And the news of this life-changing story comes from the margins. Mark says that the women fled the tomb that day terrified, and they didn't say anything, except they did. Somebody in that group found the courage to tell her story, to risk being called a fool, and somebody heard her and believed her. Listen again to the story of resurrection. If you have ever felt misrepresented, unheard, without hope, if you have ever felt invisible from your place in the margins, if you have ever felt unable to tell your truth, then the story of resurrection is a story for you. Because sometimes the stories that sound the most foolish are the stories that change the world. Now it's our turn to tell this story. If you're feeling a bit afraid about that, don't worry. You're in good company. You and I join a long line of witnesses who insist that the world's story of evil and death and power used to push people aside and keep them down is not the end of the story. Today is Easter, and we will be fools too, telling a story of hope and new life that can change the world all over again. May it be so. Amen.